With just 4 days to go before the midterm elections, at least 27 million Americans have already cast their ballots in early voting. But if you still don't think your vote matters, I want you to listen to a story that Oprah tells.
I didn't take voting seriously until around my mid-20s. And around my mid-20s, I had the privilege of hearing Reverend Otis Moss Jr., who's a preacher. Y'all know him? Preacher in Cleveland, Ohio. And I heard him tell the story of his father, of Otis Moss Sr., who right here in Georgia's Troup County got up in the morning and put on his only suit and his best tie. And he walked 6 miles to the voting poll location he was told to go to in LaGrange. And when he got there, after walking 6 miles in his good suit and tie, they said, "Boy, you at the wrong place. You're at the wrong place. You need to go over to Mountville." So he walked another 6 miles to Mountville. And when he got there, they said, "Boy, you at the wrong place. You need to go to the Rosemont School." And I picture him walking from dawn to dusk in his suit, his feet tired, getting to the Rosemont School, and they say, "Boy, you too late. The polls are closed." And he never had a chance to vote. By the time the next election came around, he had died. So when I go to the polls and I cast my ballot, I cast it for a man I never knew. I cast it for Otis Moss Sr., who walked 18 miles one day just for the chance to vote.
Joining me now, Reverend Otis Moss Jr. and Derek Johnson, President and CEO of the NAACP. So glad to have both of you on. Reverend, you first. Thank you for being here, and thank you to your father, because his story speaks to what so many people of color and women and other disenfranchised people went through to vote.
And thank you, Don, and thank you for the work you do.
She's telling that story, Reverend, and I think about when I was born. I am the first person who was, I guess, with full rights to vote, born in that time, because everyone born in my family, my sisters were born before the Voting Rights Act. I was born after the Voting Rights Act, so I had full rights, and that in the Civil Rights Act of 1968. And here I am. I mean, it has not been that long ago. And I think about my mom, who tells me the story of my grandmother, who used to have to count the jelly beans or the things in the jar. But those stories are real. And when, you were 11 years old when your dad walked those 18 miles. Do you remember anything about that day? What do you remember?
That is correct. I remember it well. I remember that early morning when he got up with enthusiasm and determination to go and vote. Really, to vote against a racist governor of Georgia who used the N-word as though it was an obligation in his vocabulary. And we sat at home waiting enthusiastically with great anticipation for our father's return, because we knew what his determination was and what our aspirations were. And when he returned home and gave us the report, there was a sadness, a kind of heartbreak that one carries to some extent for the rest of your days. Because by the time of the next election, our father was dead, having been killed in an automobile accident not too far from where we lived. And of course, our grandfather was born enslaved. So he was born when it was illegal for a black person to vote. And my father lived through that era when the enforcement of voter suppression by Klan and by other kinds of serious and evil means, and to come through that period and then participate in the civil rights movement and the voting rights effort, and to share with Dr. King in the march from Selma to Montgomery, and to witness what has taken place is quite a moment. And today, it is to me a sin not to vote if you are eligible to vote.
You are absolutely right. And I just wanted, can we put the picture up? This is your father back around that time that we have a picture of him.
That's actually some years earlier.
He was
quite a young man.
Yeah.
Yes, but it's very much his likeness. He was a quiet, determined man all of his life, and
very dignified. And he looks very dignified in that photograph, which Oprah, I think, spoke of. You know, his dignity and his tenacity to try to make a difference for not only for his family, for you guys, but for the country. I want to bring Derek in here. This is a decades-old story, Derek, of voter suppression. Yet today we're still hearing examples of this happening all over the country. What is going on? Why is that?
Well, that story there, that's the story of the South. That's the story of African Americans' journey to fully participate in this democracy. And as a result of that story and so many others, we had a Voting Rights Act. But unfortunately, the Supreme Court gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And that has resulted in the NAACP and many other organizations having to file lawsuits in Georgia to ensure that 53,000 voter registration applications are processed. Today we had another court ruling in North Carolina where they gerrymandered districts for racial reasons. Last week we filed a lawsuit successfully in Tennessee because they didn't want to process voter registration applications. And this week we had to file challenges in 4 counties in Georgia and reviewing a potential challenge in Texas because individuals are going to the polling place casting their ballots, but the ballot is not reflecting the actual vote they're cast. And so the story we're hearing there, a touching story, is the true journey of African Americans to make democracy work for everyone.
Yeah. Derek, I need to ask you about Michael Cohen's, the president's former lawyer and fixer, his account of some of the racist conversations, alleged racist conversations that he said he had with President Trump. In particular, he says the president says black people are too stupid to vote for me. That's a quote. Do you believe President Trump would say such a thing?
Absolutely. He's demonstrated at every turn, both in word and action, that he is in fact a racist. The comments about African nations being S-hole countries, his creating false equivalencies during the Charlottesville, Virginia march. I believe that this president lacked the ability to see anything outside of his own image and respect people for their human self.
Yeah. Reverend, in the short time we have left, and I apologize for that, you have any final thoughts for us, please?
Well, actually, when we look at what happened to my father 72 years ago and what's going on now, not just in the South, but throughout the nation, and the majority Congress, the Senate and the Congress, are actually bowing to that, supporting it, making it possible. So it's not just a regional issue, it's a national issue. It starts at the local level, but it is approved at the national level. And we must teach and insist from generation to generation that everyone should become a part of the voting process. And if there is any kind of impediment, there should be protest and action. As I said earlier, to refuse to vote when you can is a sin, but to be prevented from voting is a crime and a sin. And we have hate, crime, and sin uniting in this election, and we must overcome that, and we can, and I believe we will.
Thank you, Reverend. Thank you, Derek. I appreciate your time. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
We'll be right back.